Afternoon, John, you ready? Where are you?
You good?
Okay, you're good to go? Okay, good, we're recording this. Anyway, welcome. I'm Tony Puente, Professor of Psychology, and we're very delighted to have a real historical figure with us this afternoon. Dr. Reuben Silver, I don't know how else to tell you that he really started clinical psychology. This is not a history psychology lecture on my part, but I will tell you that if you look at the history of psychology in the U.S., we really have had two epochs. One is primarily academic, and the last 50 years have been very heavily clinical. After World War II, there was a big influx, an influence on the role of clinical psychology, which heretofore had not been in existence. And there was a real big vacuum to make that happen. To make that happen, Reuben came along. Reuben obtained his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from NYU after coming from Northeastern in 1951. After a stint, for a short time at the University of Minnesota Medical School, he moved back east to what is now referred to as the University of Albany, or State University at Albany, in a medical school. And Reuben was the first in many ways. He was the first to establish one of the first licensing laws in the United States in New York. He was an early leader in psychology, both at the New York State Psychological Association and American Psychological Association. He was probably one of the first, if not the first, psychologist to run a psychiatry clinic at a medical school. He was one of the first psychologists to supervise psychiatrists, one of the first to establish psychology in the role that we have today. He was awarded many different acknowledgments, but the biggest one is the one that Carl Rogers received, and that is the Distinguished Practice Award, Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association. We were very lucky not only to have him speak to us, but also for him to decide that the Albany winters were way too rough. So he relocated to Wilmington, where he has a very small private practice, and he spends most of his time enjoying himself. We're very delighted to have with us this afternoon Dr. Reuben Silver.
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to have to sit down because I can't stand bluntly. So if I'm too far from the mic that you can't hear me, raise your hand. And I usually speak so loudly that you can hear me in the next room. And I'm on the telephone. You know, I share offices with Tony. When I'm on the telephone, I think everybody in the whole office can hear me. So. Okay. You can interrupt me at any time you wish. You can ask me questions, you can make comments, you can make objections. As I said, I do have a prepared presentation. That's because, B.F. Skinner had said that after a certain age, don't speak in compound, complex sentences. So the best thing to do is to have it prepared. You see, the reason you can't speak in compound, complex sentences after a certain age is that you forget what the real theme was of that sentence. So it pays to have it written out. Now, I date the beginning of modern clinical psychology to the end of World War II. Of course, there were some psychologists who had begun doing clinical work with patients much earlier. Leitner Whitner at the University of Pennsylvania had established the first psychological clinic in 1896 with the aim of helping children with learning disabilities. Binet in France had developed a method of evaluating children's intelligence. And Louis Terman brought the Binet to the US in 1916. So testing was established long before World War II. Just as an aside, by the way, some of my own mentors, when I started graduate school, were still using the Binet because they knew it from the time that it first come in. So testing was established long before World War II. Edgar Dole had produced the Vineland while he was working at that institution. However, few psychologists were working in mental health centers or seeing so-called psychiatric patients. F.L. Wells, for example, who was at the Boston Psychopathic, now more recently referred to as Mass Mental Health, had developed a, quote, mental examiner's handbook. And David Chacko at Worcester State Hospital was involved with those patients in the 20s. I start my own education and training with World War II. Testing, as I've already said, was certainly in evidence, but psychotherapy was not. Carl Rogers had just brought forth his client-centered book. Note that at the time, his approach was not directed to patients, at least not patients with significant difficulties. It was only after Rogers moved from the Rochester Child Guidance Clinic in New York to the University of Chicago that people began to take notice. Just as an aside, however, Rogers had trouble at Chicago with the then head of psychiatry, Knight Aldrich, who was at the medical school, of course. And so Rogers decided to move on to the University of Wisconsin. There, of course, he did attempt to expose his approach to severely ill and persistently mentally ill, the so-called Spumonies, but the result was not that impressive. David Rappaport, are these names that ring any bells with you folks? Okay. David Rappaport had come to the Menninger Clinic. By the way, if you really know about the Menninger Clinic, if you pronounce it Menninger, if you're pronouncing Menninger, that means you never knew anything about the Menninger Clinic. They pronounced it Menninger. So David Rappaport had come to the Menninger Clinic hungry for testing. All patients coming to Menninger's, all were given a battery of psychological tests consisting of the Wechsler, the Rorschach, the TAT, and some other methods. By the way, as an aside, if you look at the Organization and Pathology of Thought that Rappaport published, you can tell that his background was as a Talmudic scholar. Anybody know what I mean by that? It's unimportant if you don't. It's something within the Jewish literature. His background, his texts on psychological testing, written with Roy Schaefer, one of his psychology students, and who Schaefer became well known in analytic circles, and Merton Gill, a psychiatrist then at Menninger's, was long considered a classic. When I entered the field, patients were to have a battery of psychological tests. I recall hearing Carl Menninger, perhaps the most important psychiatrist of his day, say that he wouldn't consider treating a patient in the absence of a complete psychological evaluation. Intelligence testing belonged to psychology. Binet, as I said, Terman, Goddard, and Dahl were psychologists. Rorschach, of course, was a psychiatrist, as was Henry Murray of TAT fame. And so was Loretta Bender of the Bender Gestalt. As I finished my education, there were two main emphases in psychotherapy: client-centered and psychoanalysis. The advantage of client-centered approach was that therapy told you specifically what to do. But in medical centers, psychoanalysis was king. In fact, it was unusual to find a head of psychiatry in an American medical school who was not an analyst. However, analytic institutes in the US would not permit psychologists to enter their training programs. Only physicians were acceptable. There were some exceptions, such as David Rappaport. who agreed not to practice. In Europe, the situation, of course, was different. Papa Sigmund himself, Freud, had analyzed Theodore Reich, a psychologist, perhaps best known for his text, Listening with the Third Ear. In fact, when Reich came to the United States, Freud had written to his American friends supporting Reich, but didn't help. However, Reich set up his own training program in New York City, and some psychologists were able to be trained in psychoanalysis. I'm talking the early. It is of considerable interest to me to note that some of Freud's earliest disciples had not been trained in medicine or psychology. Erik Erikson, for example, came to psychoanalysis from art. Also, there were Americans that went to Vienna, were analyzed by Freud himself during a summer, and returned to the US and practiced psychoanalysis. When I arrived in Albany, there were two, I guess, who had gone over to Vienna and flopped down on the couch or reclined on the couch and had themselves analyzed over a summer and came back to practice. In later years, of course, analysis, it would be, now years, but in those early years, Freud successfully treated, put that in quotes, the famous composer Gustav Mahler in 5 sessions, and Bruno Walter, the eminent conductor, in one 5-hour session strolling through the gardens. Now, I may be confusing which of the two was treated in one session, but it was either those two were treated very briefly. Although psychologists couldn't enroll in institutes that were affiliated with the American Psychoanalytic Association, they could undergo therapy from training analysis, and those in New York certainly did. Knowing that psychoanalysis was the treatment of choice, I reclined on the couch during some of my time in New York City. Had I remained, I might have enrolled at either Reich's Institute or at the Postgraduate Institute of Psychotherapy, which Lou Wohlberg, the psychiatrist author of a significant text on psychotherapy, had established as a training program, but it was never affiliated with the American Psychoanalytic Association. Students would, I recall paying $15 per session for 3 sessions per week. And by the way, that was a lot of money. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, I just recently read the letters of Leonard Bernstein. You know, Bernstein, the very famous conductor of the New York Philharmonic. And of course, Bernstein came out of a wealthy background. And he says he was in therapy, and it's very difficult the way Bernstein writes. He calls all these people, he calls her Frau so-and-so. Of course, it's difficult to identify because he calls Frau so-and-so, and he gives them kind of a nickname, so I can't really tell who his therapist was, although I have a hunch it was Hilhina Deutsch, who was in the area at that time. And since Bernstein was from a very affluent family, I suspect he picked someone of considerable prestige in the area. However, by the time Wohlberg started, I had decided to move to Minnesota to accept a job at a newly established state mental health clinic on the grounds of the state hospital. I took that job because it was to pay me $6,000 per year and provide me with room and board. In fact, I had a nice apartment on the grounds, had daily maid service, and they accommodated to my dietary habits and restrictions. I don't eat pork and shellfish and things like that. Since I ate in the doctor's dining room, it wasn't much of a problem. When those forbidden foods were on the menu, the kitchen prepared something different for me. During that period, I was single, and I had more disposable income than I have ever had since, because I had no expenses. The clinic was staffed by me and a recent bachelor's social worker and a psychiatrist. My experience, therefore, was similar to physicians who had gone to third world countries and learned much more than they could in the United States because of the need to treat patients even in the absence of appropriate experience. After I'd been in the clinic for a few years, the superintendent of that hospital, or the director of the hospital, called me to come to the hospital to establish a psychology department. When I arrived at the state hospital, there were only 2 physicians who were knowledgeable about mental disorders. One was the superintendent or the director, and the other was the clinical director. The superintendent, by the way, incidentally, in Minnesota at that time, the law required that the superintendent of a mental hospital be a homeopathic physician. Interesting. That, of course, is not the case. That particular superintendent had been trained at Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, probably the best mental health facility of the day, at least of a state institution. The rest of the physicians knew nothing about mental problems. Some of the physicians even had cognitive problems of their own. When patients were staffed, the superintendent looked to me, not to the physicians who supposedly were in charge of that patient. When patients were to be interviewed on the ward, the physician always looked to me to perform the task. Nurses didn't bother with the physician. They came to me. After I joined the hospital, John Rosen, a New York psychiatrist, published a paper in which he claimed to have resolved the psychosis in a schizophrenic patient. Well, there I was in Minnesota, having attended a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, where Rosen had presented his work. So I thought I should try his method. I could not completely follow Rosen's approach because some of it basically seemed weird to me. But I tried. But I decided to desist after the clinical director told me, he said, "Reuben, I see you are making great progress with that patient. Today she told me that her brain was being used by J. Robert Oppenheimer." I'll bet nobody in the class here remembers J. Robert Oppenheimer, the very famous physicist involved with the atomic bomb. She told me that her brain was being used by J. Robert Oppenheimer as a transmitting station. Incidentally, by the way, later a study indicated that Rosen's work was not effective. Despite previous attempts, even prior to Rosen's work, that had resulted in disappointing outcomes, the attempt to apply that type of treatment continued. There had been some previously well-designed studies involving established analysts treating severely mentally and persistently ill mental patients, and they produced negative results. Some, such as Bert Caron, currently at Michigan State University, and Gary Vanderboss, you know him, they published this book, Psychotherapy with Schizophrenia. Gary Vanderboss is now at APA. They claim that those practitioners had lacked experience with such patients. That was true enough. In fact, analysts of that era were only treating what has been called the worried well. Of course, she had a sophisticated group of housewives to whom she gave a reading list that was the equivalent to what most advanced graduate students would be proud to have studied. But if she could do it with housewives, why couldn't Reuben Silver do it with unsophisticated mental health aides who had the most contact with patients in mental hospitals. At that time, Dale Cameron, the psychiatrist who was commissioner of mental health in Minnesota, liked the idea and provided funds for such a project. So we selected a group of aides, started meeting with them and teaching them about mental health and intervention. The aides were to meet with their assigned patients and have supervision a couple of times a week for a week. A couple of times a week for a year. Since we thought we were onto something, we also gave each of the aides a long battery of tests with the hope of finding who we could select to be the best therapist. Now, of course, it didn't succeed. The patients were too chronic, the aides not up to the task, and the time certainly not long enough. However, as a result of that, Cameron offered me a post in central office. It was a good paying job, much more than I was making at the state hospital. But it would have been more administration than I wanted, and so I turned down the offer. And Cameron selected Howie Davis, who went with him to St. Elizabeth's, and from there, Howie went on to NIMH, and he became a very important figure at NIMH in the, must have been in the 60s, although I don't exactly remember what years those were. Before I could make a decision, however, Howard Rome, head of psychiatry at Mayo's, was interested, at the Mayo Clinic, was interested in developing psychology at that clinic and offered me that post. However, Mayo had not yet developed a medical school. Thus, when Stark Hathaway of MMPI fame, who knew of my work at the state hospital, offered me an academic appointment in clinical psychology, I accepted his offer. The psychologists at Minnesota, in my mind, were absolutely exceptional. Hathaway, who was the head of psychology in medical school, was the mentor of Paul Meehl. I hope that rings a bell with this group. If it doesn't, hang your heads in shame. Meehl clearly was a giant of an intellect. And by the way, just as an aside, Meehl, maybe I say it later on, Meehl was one of those youngsters at age 9 or 10 or 8, whenever it was, that Louis Terman selected and reported on the genetic studies of genius. So, you know, they were up there. Not like Kalita Hollingsworth, who selected kids who were 180 and above. That was much earlier, but Terman's studies, of course, was more important and went on for years. I said Meehl was a giant of an intellect, and Bill Schofield wasn't exactly ordinary. Hathaway had obtained his Ph.D. from Ohio State in physiological psychology. When he came to Minnesota, he managed to get himself over to the medical school, where J. Cholmondeley McKinley, whose name appears on the MMPI, and that was a brainstorm of Hathaway's, you see, to put the head of the Department of Psychiatry, who had been head of medicine and, you know, was the really big name over there, where J. Cholmondeley McKinley was the head of psychiatry and a very important figure in the university. Hathaway learned a great deal from McKinley, and soon was recognized as one of the bright lights of Minnesota. Paul Meehl used to say when he was a graduate student at Minnesota that there were two faculty who were considered geniuses. One was B.F. Skinner, who was there at the time, and the other was Stark Hathaway. And since from early on, Meehl was interested in mental issues, he of course chose Hathaway. In fact, Meehl became interested in that whole field by reading Carl Menninger's early works. On the other hand, Hathaway was never psychoanalytic through his life. When I came to Minnesota, I was initially assigned to be the supervising psychologist in outpatient psychiatry, to be involved with medical students, psychology trainees, and psychiatry residents. The psychiatrists in outpatient psychiatry were trained analysts in those days. So now I could again recline on the couch and obtain supervision on my therapy patients from analysts. And remember, in those days, that was what you wanted to do. I shared that session with a colleague, and I recall some of those sessions when our supervisor would tell my colleague, and I'm quoting, "You have to get in there to interpret the penis envy to your patient." Well, that caused my colleague many problems. First, he didn't know how to do it. Secondly, he didn't believe it. And even if he had believed it, he couldn't have given that interpretation. I learned a great deal from my time in Minnesota. My supervisor taught me a great deal. And I saw Hathaway treat several patients. If Hathaway were to treat a patient, he would insist that the patient permit his students, in quotes, to be on the other side of the one-way screen. And the entire faculty were his students as far as he was concerned. The students were advanced graduate students, faculty, no matter who they were. Also, Hathaway held monthly evening sessions at his home. Visiting dignitaries were always invited to those evening sessions. I recall one session with Leo Connor, who coined the term infantile autism. And Connor was one of those rare child psychiatrists who could estimate a child's IQ, and it turned out to be right on the button, by using some simple tasks that he would ask the child to perform. It was fantastic. During Hathaway's tenure, all patients coming to psychiatry were asked to complete the MMPI. It used to be said that Hathaway built the MMPI and Paul Meehl sold it. In those days, everyone was given the MMPI, whether they were patients, students, seeking admission to graduate school, seeking admission to medical school, everybody was given the MMPI. The initial version of the MMPI consisted of cards with statements which the client or patient sorted into two piles, true and false. A quick method was developed for the person doing the testing to record the patient's responses. So you didn't have to record all of them, you see. Eventually Hathaway had those items printed on IBM cards and then sent those boxes over to the computer center for machine scoring. The profile was returned the next day. I adopted that role of administering the MMPI to all patients coming to the state mental health clinic and later to the state hospital from the time that I first arrived in Minnesota. My supervisor at the time were from the University of Minnesota. As a result, I became proficient with the MMPI. Having come from New York, I was considered to be the expert with projectives. Although projectives were taught at Minnesota, psychology students, although projectives was taught to Minnesota psychology student, that was not the emphasis. No one on the faculty was committed to that approach. As a graduate student, I had a course with Rorschach, on the Rorschach with Zygmunt Piotrowski, Bruno Klopfer, Marguerite Hertz, and Sam Beck. Those were the big four that later became part of the current use of the Rorschach. I was going to give you an example of Klopfer, but I think I'll skip that. It has always been of interest to me that psychologists have flocked to get themselves analyzed, psychoanalyzed. Neil Miller, ring a bell? You know who Neil Miller is? Neil Miller, the famous experimental psychologist in the middle 30s, went to Berlin, reclined on the couch, and got himself analyzed by no less a person than Karl Abraham. Took the best. That same Miller was one of the authors of the book on personality, Dollard and Miller, 1950 or 51, I forgot which date that was published, in which the attempt is made to translate psychoanalytic concepts into learning theory. It is interesting to note that that approach did not provide a different framework for doing therapy. Dollard and Miller had made psychoanalysis more acceptable to psychologists. E.G. Boring, The History of Psychology, Sensation of Perception in the History of Psychology, was another one of those psychologists in that era who also entered treatment with Hans Sachs, the training analyst. There was an interesting article in the Journal of Abnormal and Social about 1940. The fact that when he got to be the first editor, the founding editor of Contemporary Psychology, he always considered himself a failure, somebody that never amounted to anything. So there was a response from Hans Sachs, but because of the privacy, he was not able to go into much detail. Despite the fact that he was one of the shining lights at Harvard, and despite being called Mr. Psychologist when he became the first editor of Contemporary, Boring believed that he had never accomplished much in life. Even Paul Meehl, who hobnobbed with the logical positives, such as Herbert Feigl, Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, never questioned the utility of analytic therapy. He got himself analyzed. He reclined on the couch. He had a couch in his office. Although he was not immune to the developments of other approaches, he continued to invite patients to lie down on the couch. That's Meehl. Remember, Meehl is the fellow who taught us about the superiority of statistical versus clinical prediction, and the importance of base rates in making judgments. See his landmark study in the Psychological Bulletin in the middle 50s with Albert Rosen. Of minor interest is, I told you about that Meehl was one of those selected by Terman in his genetic studies of genius. Al Ellis practiced psychoanalysis before he developed REBT. That was the zeitgeist. While I was at University of Minnesota, one of the psychiatrists received an offer from Albany to join the Department of Psychiatry. He was a psychoanalyst, trained at the Columbia Psychoanalytic Institute under Sandor Rado. When my colleague reached Albany, he convinced the Department of Psychiatry to offer me a post. Because they offered me 50% more than I was making, and I was to become chief of psychology, I accepted that offer. Upon my arrival, there was a big to-do about me. The dean of the medical college had a big party welcoming me and introduced me to the faculty. One of the people present was the head of surgery, who had established a group which he called the Lunar Society. The Lunar Society met monthly in the evening to discuss topics of interest. I was able to present on the MMPI, which impressed this guy. And as a result, he asked me to accompany him on surgical rounds. So I developed a relationship with him, which turned into a good referral source and a good friend to have in the medical school. You know, the two most important faculty people in the medical school are the head of surgery and the head of medicine. At Minnesota, I had been impressed with seeing therapy practiced in front of the one-way screen. Also at Minnesota, some of the outpatients were seen by third-year medical students. The psychiatrist would enter the room during the session so that the responsible physician could see what was going on with the patient. While we continued that system at Albany, we introduced a more direct observational system. A new patient would be interviewed by a medical student with a supervisor and the other students on the clerkship on the other side of the screen. The student had a receiver in his ear, which permitted us to communicate directly with the student, telling him the exact words to say if he was off target. If necessary, we would enter the room and take over. Since I thought that Hathaway's method of doing psychotherapy in front of the one-way screen had merit, I thought I would introduce that system at Albany. The trained analyst, of course, refused to be observed during therapy sessions. Their objection was that it interfered with the therapeutic process. Others were unwilling to expose themselves to possible criticism, so the task of doing observed psychotherapy fell to me. When I arrived in Albany, the supervision of psychiatry residents was restricted to those psychiatrists who were trained in psychoanalysis. My aim was to become a member of that elite group. To get the attention of that group, I deliberately flaunted my knowledge of psychotherapy literature. After that group began to accept me to a degree, I suggested that we form a peer supervision group that would meet in our homes a couple of times a month on Saturday afternoon. After a short time, I became designated as the psychotherapy supervisor of psychiatry residents, which was not usual in medical settings. At Albany, I became involved with the college in many ways. It wasn't long before I was a member of the admissions committee, and by the way, in medical schools, they spend a fortune selecting medical students, and once you get into medical school, it's very difficult to flunk out. They don't want you to flunk out. They go through all sorts of shenanigans to prevent you from dropping out. You may have to repeat a year, you might have to repeat 2 years, but you don't drop out. The only way you drop out, we used to say, was if you raped the dean's wife, that might get you dropped out, but we weren't certain of that because it hadn't happened yet. Because the members of the committee assumed that I had special talents in predicting success in medical school, after all, I was a psychologist, I must be able to read minds and make those kinds of predictions, right? I had a disproportionate impact on who was admitted. In medical college, I just told you about promotions committee. Soon I became chair of the department's appointments and promotions committee, and later a member of the college's all appointments committee, appointments and promotions committee, and I was a member of various other committees. Somewhere along the line, I had an invitation to visit a Midwestern university for a professorship in psychology. Our then Dean Hal Wiggers learned of that invitation, and he called me in his office. He suggested that I make the visit, because he said I would always wonder if I had made a mistake by not going. He also told me to come back to talk to him before making a decision. After I returned, he told me that the directorship of the Medical Center Outpatient Psychiatry Clinic would have a vacancy, and he thought I was the person to fill that post. So I became head of the clinic. At about the same time, a new state psychiatric center was opening adjacent to the medical center, right attached. The director of the center and the head of psychiatry of the college would be the same person. That was a similar situation existed at Columbia Medical School and the New York State Psychiatric Institute in New York. And a similar situation was at Harvard Medical School with mass mental health. So I was offered a post as non-medical chief of service at the new psychiatric center. So now I had 2 jobs. At each I had psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, students, psych trainees, and aides responsible for a catchment area. As director of the Medical Center Psychiatry Clinic, I believe I was the first psychologist in this country to occupy that post. There had been deans of medical schools before I had my post, but those were administrative. Carlisle Jacobson at Syracuse and Johnny Connors at the University of Colorado had been deans. But to have a non-psychiatrist as head of a medical center clinic with direct responsibility was an unknown thing. Hopkins tried it with the biologist Seymour Kenny, an outstanding researcher, which probably many of you must know him. But that didn't work out, and he didn't last, because he really wasn't a clinician. There were psychologists several years later, in later years, who were acting heads of psychiatry departments, such as Bud Orgel at Syracuse and Jack Carr at Washington come to mind. And Joe Matarazzo, of course, achieved a milestone when he established a separate department of psychology at the School of Medicine at the University of Oregon. The psychiatry clinic at Albany soon became known as Reuben's Clinic. That's the way everybody in the medical school used to refer to it. Send him to Reuben's Clinic. I ran the admission meeting where the treatment plan was developed. We even had a medical clinic for patients who basically needed long-term follow-up for their meds. And some of our psychiatrists with clinical appointments volunteered their time. Some trained in the old charity clinics of Mass General Hospital behaved in ways that I found objectionable. Some would go out to the waiting room and yell, "Smith!" or whatever the person's name was. To handle that problem, I talked to those offenders and told them that they deserved better from us. That effective immediately, they wouldn't have to go out to get their own patients. I would see to it that the patients were brought into there. While I was at the State Hospital at Minnesota, I had attended psychodrama workshop with Jacob Moreno, a psychiatrist who came to the U.S. from Hungary. But I wanted to learn more about group processes. At Albany, at department expense, I did a 2-week stay at the National Training Labs in Bethel. I don't know if any of you know of that. Do you know of that, the National Training Labs? Yeah, well, it was modeled after the work of the Michigan group. The next year I went out to Esalen in California. Anybody know about Esalen? You do? Okay. Well, that's a weird place. Again, I went at department expense to learn about the work that they were doing. And that, as I say, that was a wild experience, believe me. Will Schutz and Fritz Perls, I don't know if any of you know Fritz Perls, were there, and I was in a group with Will Schutz. The experience, let me tell you, was absolutely bizarre. National Training Labs was interesting and good. But the experience at Esalen was bizarre. Perhaps at another time, and in another setting, I'll share with you what was going on at Esalen. It's difficult to tell you that at this time. But I needed more sanity about group processes. Accordingly, I went for a stint at the Tavistock program. Tavistock was really an analytic program in England, but they would have these programs here in the United States. So I went to a Tavistock program based on psychoanalytic principles, where Wilfred Bion, the great guru who had developed that system, was present. Although I led some Tavistock-type groups after that, I lost interest in those approaches fairly rapidly. About the same time, I had some training in family therapy from Virginia Satir. Anybody know of her? Is she still known? Okay. Virginia Satir, family therapy, a social worker, and also Jay Haley. By the way, I never knew what his educational background was, but he was kind of very prominent back there. For all I know, he didn't have anything but a bachelor's degree, for all I know.
Master's, I think.
He had a master's, okay.
Communications.
He was an interesting fellow, by the way, because if you, he had some interesting ideas. He was from the Palo Alto group in family therapy, which was heavily influenced by the work of the anthropologist Gregory Bateson. who was the husband of Margaret Mead. Perhaps because of that experience, I had an invitation to visit the Jewish Family Services in New York City, where Nate Ackerman, a well-respected psychiatrist, was their leading family therapist. I attended a couple of his family therapy sessions, made some comments on the process, and finally realized that they wanted me to set up some research for that system. At that time, I had no interest in moving to New York City, cost of living being what it was, in contrast to Albany. Did not know how to set up a research study that would meet their needs, nor did I have an interest in doing so. I think what attracted the Jewish Family Service was my youthful looks, because in those years I could have passed for a bar mitzvah boy. Anybody know what that means? That's when you're 13, you get you enter into adulthood, and as a Jewish man, you can partake in the services, and you count. It was now time for another venture. Although we had psychology students who spent time with us as part of their course study, we had not bothered to develop an internship program. I thought we would be in a unique position to do so. I was still both with the Medical College Hospital and with the Psychiatric Center. Though I was relinquishing my post with the Psych Center to become chief of psychology there, which would be less demanding of my time, and I, of course, had a relationship with the VA, I was on their payroll, which was just across the street. And one of my psychology supervisees had been named Commissioner of Mental Health for Albany County. So why not develop a consortium predoctoral internship using those agencies? All the administrators went for it. And it didn't take long before we were APA accredited. Sometime in the 80s, why this happens I don't know, is sometimes in the 80s, my dear friend Mort Berger, who was dean at Yeshivas for Kalf School of Psychology, was killed in a car accident. The provost at the university approached me about considering the deanship of that school. By that time, I was earning more money than Yeshiva could pay me, and it would be living in New York again. So if you take a cut in salary and you move to New York City, forget it. I was making more money than Yeshiva could pay me. I was getting money from the college, from the hospital, from the psych center, from the VA, and from the county clinic. But that, by the way, was not unusual in medical settings. In medical schools, clinical faculty, those who are clinicians are expected to, oh wait a minute, I'm jumping ahead. Yes, wait a minute. I was getting money from the college, as I said. I needed to make less. I also needed to make less in private practice because in my salary at the medical school, you see, in medical schools, basically, if you're in the clinical departments, you have to generate your own income. And that's usually pretty easy to do because it's an in-house situation. They refer to you. Why would they refer outside the family? But in medical schools, so you have to generate your own salary. But if you're in administration, if you can somehow say that you're doing work in administration, you have to generate less and less. So the amount that you earn above the amount that you had agreed, you keep. Shortly before the development that I've just discussed, the medical school decided to develop a private practice school. the issue arose concerning fees that psychologists could charge. The executive committee of the department, of which I had been member since my arrival, thought there should be a differential, naturally, between the fee structure for psychologists that would be less than what psychiatrists charged. I opposed that idea, obviously. I then contacted my colleagues in many of the medical schools in the United States to ask for their guidance. All told me I couldn't win that battle. The belief was that psychiatrists always charged more than psychologists. At a later meeting of the department's executive committee, this suggestion was made that perhaps my field's fees, Reuben Silver's fees, could be the same as the psychiatrist. But I said, let's not go that route. If we're going to have differentials in fee, a differential fee system, let's base it on academic rank. Now, of course, that was a killer, because the other psychiatrists in the department who weren't, for example, full professors, I was a full professor, I'd been a full professor there since God knows when. The guys that weren't full professors, or the gals that weren't full professors, they were going to take less. You think that was going to fly in seeing patients? So there went the whole process, and psychologists then could charge the same. You see, the issue of fees was that when you saw the patient, you gave the slip that the patient gave to as the patient left, and that was the charge. You just put in the CPT code. You see, that tells you what was done, and the charge is automatic. Wait a minute, where am I? My initial argument was that I had taught most of the psychiatrists, both in the department and in the community, how to do psychotherapy. So how did it make sense for a psychologist to charge less than those whom I personally had trained? After establishing myself at Albany as a talented psychotherapist, I realized that I needed to broaden my knowledge in clinical psychology. When I was a graduate student, there was no specialty in neuropsychology. Certainly Ward Halstead, chair of psychology, I think at Chicago, but maybe he was at Worcester, or maybe he was at Chicago after Worcester, and his student Ralph Reitan were developing techniques to assess brain damaged patients. But students of my era were not exposed to that information. To remedy that deficiency, I took some workshops with Edith Kaplan, the Boston process approach, and Charles Golden from Luria, Nebraska. Luria was a Russian neurologist who developed a number of clinical techniques to study the brain injured. And of course, Kurt Goldstein, a physician who had been working with brain-injured patients. Recall his work with the loss of the abstract attitude. After our pre-doctoral internship was in full swing, we offered some of the interns the opportunity to learn about neuropsychology from a neuropsychologist. I sat in on all of those presentations. Also, after the State Psychiatric Center opened in Albany, the facility, the director, decided that the psychiatric staff needed a refresher in neuroanatomy. Since the presenter was to be the head of neurology at the college and a good friend of mine, I took the course with the physician. A good part of my time and their time was spent in viewing brain size. That doesn't mean that I became a neuropsychologist. I did not. But I just thought I should have been exposed, should know something about the field in general. I also felt the need to learn more about psychopharmacology. We were able to convince one of our psychopharmacologists in the department to offer an elective for our interns. I sat in on those presentations. The initial course was too heavily concerned with pharmacokinetics and not with practical aspects. Eventually, it was possible to arrive at an appropriate compromise. It's very difficult to get psychopharmacologists to reduce the amount given over to basic pharmacology. Of course, following the program of the Department of Defense to train psychologists in RXP, psychopharmacology that is, those of us who attended APA would sign up for sessions with one of those graduates. In Albany, I decided that if I were to consider myself a well-rounded psychologist, I needed to learn something about other approaches to psychotherapy. An obit on psychologist Andrew Salter, a recent obit, mentioned his 1949 book, Conditioned Reflex Therapy, and it said it has a significant impact. I can tell you, being in New York at that time and as a graduate student, I think most of us dismissed his work. But a decade later, Joe Wolpe published his Psychotherapy by Reciprocal Inhibition in '58, followed by The Practice of Psychotherapy in '68. Those books had a significant impact. So off I went to Philadelphia to learn from Wolpe, and he was impressive. He brought in a patient with a fear of heights, whom he was able to get control of the anxiety after a very short time in the session. Later, when Dave Ballower came to Albany, I learned of his panic control treatment. At Albany, I was exposed to the work of the cultural anthropologist when the Department of Psychiatry hired a young man in that area. He had a grant to study people in British Guyana, which is now Guyana in South America. He thought he also wanted to administer the Rorschach to those subjects. I agreed to teach him how to administer that test. As a result, he delivered a paper on that subject at the meeting of the American Anthropological Association, which I attended with him, and at which time I met Margaret Mead. Unlike an APA convention, the entire attendance of anthropologists at their annual convention were able to sit in one room for dinner. Now, you can't do that at an APA convention. What was striking about that meeting was that the entire convention sat down in one room. In the early 70s, there existed a small association of heads of psychiatry and medical schools in the Northeast. At each of those meetings, the chair of the Department of Psychiatry that hosted the group could bring along a member of the faculty to participate in those meetings. I was so chosen. I no longer remember what we did in preparation for that meeting, except that we developed some sort of survey of what was going on in the separate departments. Those attending were a very impressive group. Herb Pardes, who was to become the head of NIMH and then head of psychiatry at Columbia, and later dean at their medical school, and eventually director of the New York Presbyterian Hospital, was the leader of a small group in which I was one of the members. And Leo Eisenberg of Harvard was also in attendance. I don't recall if Bob Michaels had assumed the chair of psychiatry at Cornell. He later was to become dean at Cornell. I suspect he wasn't there, because Michaels was one of those child wonders who had appeared on the TV program as a regular. The Whiz Kids, I suspect none of you remember that program. I suspect nobody in the room remembers that program. You don't remember that, Andy, do you?
Nope.
No.
I remember the name, but not the program.
You're too young. You're too young to remember that. Oops. I suspect Michaels was not there, because if he were in attendance, he would have made an impression with his intellect, which would not have been unnoticed. In some ways, Bob Michaels is like Larry Summers, who got into trouble at Harvard when he was president by making those remarks about women not being able to be scientists and so on, and he lost his job and so on. And of course, I remember reading an article about Summers in, maybe it was Time or maybe it was in the Atlantic, that said that Summers, in any group that he's in, has to be the brightest. And he is the brightest, but he has to let everybody else know that he is the brightest. Well, Michaels is the same way. And he probably is the brightest in the group, but he lets everybody know he's the brightest. After that meeting, I realized that we did not have anything similar for psychologists in New York. So I took it upon myself to write a letter to each psychologist whom I knew at the 13 medical schools in New York and asked about interest in forming such an association. Most responded favorably. One did not. He saw no need to associate with psychologists at other schools of medicine. However, we started. After a short time, it seemed appropriate to contact all heads of psychologists in the U.S. medical schools. In many instances, I had to direct that letter to the head of psychiatry. And by the way, at that time, most psychologists were housed in departments of psychiatry. That isn't necessarily true now, but it was back then. I had responses from most, though some psychiatry heads indicated there was no designated head of psychology. Although there had been an earlier attempt at organizing such a group, the zeitgeist was not ready at that time. It was the initial group was tried really in the very early 50s. What changed was the decision of the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Hospitals, that's what it was called at that time, to exclude psychologists from membership on the hospital staff. Indeed, psychologists woke up one day thinking that they had been members of the medical staff, and they were no longer members of the medical staff. It was the JCHO, now it's JCHO, but at that time it was JCAH, that said you had to be a physician to be on the medical staff. What changed was the Joint Commission to exclude psychologists from membership on the hospital staff. Initially, membership in this national association was to be limited to someone who would be designated the head of psychology at a specific medical college. It was not long before we recognized that that limitation was too restrictive, and the association was broadened to include all psychologists in faculty of medical schools. The name of that group has been changed to the Association of Psychologists in Academic Medical Centers, so the membership has expanded. And now that group is a section of Division 12 of APA. My stature at the medical college continued to grow. In the 70s, the Attica State Prison in upstate New York, which that's famous for that uprising. Remember, maybe you don't if you didn't live in New York. The Attica State Prison in upstate New York had transferred to it a notorious killer because everyone was concerned with his mental state or status. The Commissioner of Corrections of the state of New York asked the Commissioner of Mental Health to select a group to go to Attica to examine the inmate. Because of Albany's proximity to that facility, the psychiatry department at Albany was to provide the team to see the patient. There were 3 selected. The clinical director of the Capital District Psychiatric Center, that was one. A psychiatrist in the department who had significant experience in the prison system, and myself. When the inmate was brought in to us by the guards, he was in adequate restraints. In fact, the guards would not leave him with us. He was a big bruiser, by the way. Despite the fact that he had terrorized the previous prisons to which he had been confined, we found no evidence of a mental illness. I had been interested in professional psychology associations from the very beginning of my career. The first year I was at Albany, I was elected president of the local psychological association. The next year, I was a member of the council of the New York State Psychological Association, NISPA. And at that time, NISPA had a bicameral system, meaning it had a council, and the council elected its board of directors. And so my time on the council was immediately followed by membership on the board of directors. A few years later, I was elected president of the State Association Division of Clinical Psychology, and that same year served as president of NISPA. And that was the last time, the only time and the last time that a person in New York could serve in both capacities. When the local association developed the Distinguished Psychology Award, I was its first recipient. At least 10 or 15 years later, I was again given the same honor. Eventually also received NISPA's highest award, the Alan Williams Award, and I was the third recipient. Eventually I served on APA Council, on a few boards and committees in APA, and was elected to the office of President of the Division of Psychotherapy of APA. APA also honored me with the Distinguished Contribution Award many years ago. I was also elected a fellow. I shared that Distinguished Contribution Award with our own Tony Puente, who received it just a short time later. In the 80s, Nick Cummings organized the National Academies of Practice, consisting of practitioners in the healthcare arena. Excuse me. In due course, I was elected to that group and was designated a distinguished practitioner in psychology. My last activity with the board was as chair of the psychology group. I have since shared that honor with our own Tony Puente. I should mention that I obtained the ABEP diploma sometime in the 50s. Time does not permit me to elaborate on my experience as a candidate for the certificate. Many years ago, I was elected fellow of APA. Before closing, I should mention the others who finished their training at the dawn of modern clinical psychology. I think of Nick Cummings, Rogers Wright, Jack Wiggins, Max Siegel, Joe Matarazzo, all of those, by the way, no, Rog Wright was not, except for George Wright, those others that I've mentioned were finally elected president of APA. And I include Ivan Mensch also as one of those early ones in the development of clinical psychology. I don't include Paul Meehl because he finished his training several years earlier. One final point. Many of us who began careers in the modern era of clinical psychology thought about ourselves as psychologists, not just clinical psychologists. So I and many of my contemporaries would read the entire annual review of psychology. I regret that it's not possible for me to do that today. I continue to be a practicing psychologist and hope to be able to continue as long as I am cognitively intact. Of course, I still technically am on the faculty at Albany. I'm called Professor Emeritus, of course. I hope to continue as long as I'm cognitively intact. And I trust that Tony will tell me when I reach the point that I'm not functioning adequately. Thank you.
I'm sure Reuben will be happy to entertain questions, but I do have a question for you to start off with. Chicago did not tenure 2 people. And I wonder sometimes...
What did you say?
University of Chicago did not tenure
Yes.
2 people of importance
Yes.
in 1952.
Yes.
And I wonder, what do you think are some of the mistakes that some of us might be doing to avoid Chicago's missing? They did not tenure Rogers and
Yes.
Sperry in the same year.
That's right.
They blew it.
Yes.
How can we make sure that psychology doesn't blow it like Chicago did?
Well, psychologists would have to be, psychologists can't do it on their own. They have to do it with the rest of the faculty. I mean, you have to get important friends, and all of you have to get, if you want something done in the university, you just can't go with your own department, or at least you can't. I'm more familiar with medical schools, you see, and I will tell you, if you want things done, you've got to have friends in important places in the medical school. And medical schools are a little different, because the dean of a medical school is a very, very powerful figure. In fact, in a medical school, when a new dean comes in, the chairs of department are supposed to hand in their resignation to him. No. Most deans are smart enough not to accept it, you know, but that tells you something. So you have to work at, it's true that, well, of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the whole business of tenure, because in the public school system, tenure is on its way out. And maybe that will happen in universities and higher education. I, of course, don't look with favor on that. But there are lots of people in administration that do. And the interesting thing, people say that if you have tenure, that then people get lazy and they don't do what they were doing when they were trying to get tenure. And that, I believe, is false. Because remember, I don't know if any of you ever read Gordon Allport. Remember, he had the notion of functional autonomy, which said essentially that, my paraphrasing and perhaps doing some violence to that concept, that, you know, regardless of what the motivation was before, when you start doing it, the thing itself develops its own motivation and you keep doing it. So it's the argument that if you get tenure, you know, you stop doing, I don't think that's true.
Additional questions? I think Dr. Jackson?
Is this Cameron that you mentioned the same as Cameron and Margaret, the people who
No,
wrote?
that's an interesting point. That, the Cameron that you're talking about was Norman Cameron. Norman Cameron was a psychologist. In fact, he was professor of psychology at Wisconsin, and was anything but an analyst. And then he left Wisconsin and went to Yale. And again, remember what the zeitgeist was. So he reclined on the couch, got himself analyzed, and was no longer the same Cameron in terms of what he was writing before. Dale Cameron was a psychiatrist of considerable note in psychiatry because of his position, his administrative posts. He was big up there in NIMH. Okay.
Well, one more question, just for all of us. Where is clinical psychology headed?
Well, you know, my big interest throughout my life has been in psychotherapy. Psychotherapy as we know it, I think, is psychologists will not be that involved in psychotherapy. I think finances will prevent that. Right now, there's a downward trend in what you get for psychotherapy. You know, that's what's happened in psychiatry. You know, if a psychiatrist sees, at least that's what used to be, when I was at Albany at least, when a psychiatrist saw a patient for psychotherapy, and managed care was already in vogue. If that psychiatrist saw a patient for psychotherapy under the managed care system, he received whatever the fee was. Let's say after managed care, let's say $100 per session. But you know, if that psychiatrist saw a patient, 4 patients in an hour for a med check, and psychiatrists can do better than that. They can do 6 in a med checks in an hour. You know what the same company was paying them? They were paying them $75. Now, it doesn't take very long to realize that there's a difference between 6 times 75, or even 4 times 75, and 100. So guess what most psychiatrists were doing? I remember when I was at Albany, we interviewed a young psychiatrist who's wanted to come to the clinic. Wanted to come to the department, probably with an assignment. Well, he had been trained at Hopkins, no less. And Hopkins was, you know, historically, Hopkins was one of the places. And as a medical schools, you know, still is right up there in the top 5 probably. He knew nothing about psychotherapy. He knew he was a whiz with psychopharmacology, and he could tell you everything, you know, he wanted to know. But here's a guy out of a prestigious program, knows nothing about psychotherapy. Why should he? He's going to be making so much more money. So the trend is down for psychotherapy. So that's my hunch, is that psychologists are going to have to do other kinds of things. Now, the field that you represent, that's a good field. That's a field that's psychologist's field. That is a psychology field. See, the problem with psychotherapy is we share it with too many people. We share it with social workers, we share it with nurse practitioners, we share it with counselors. Who else do we share it with? Well, we share it with bartenders, maybe. So, psychologists are going to have to develop other means of applying psychological principles to the care of patients. And probably psychologists will do very well when they learn how to develop programs that will be able to be expanded to a large group, not just one-to-one. But by that time, I'm not going to be on this scene. There's going to be enough yet for people of my ilk. And incidentally, there aren't very many of my colleagues who are still practicing. I never understood why, but there aren't very many who finished in that many years ago and are still practicing.
Any additional questions or comments? Well, we've been very fortunate. It's rare to see someone in the field of psychology for over half a century. It's really rare for someone to speak that really says, here was the beginning. And I'm very, very lucky that we have recorded this, because I look forward to hearing this presentation again at a later time in our own careers, because we have just seen history in the making. So thank you very much for being here.